Well, hello, and welcome to the next installment of the Human Readable podcast, story that I, Cory Doctorow, wrote and that I'm reading aloud in various bits and pieces as I go. Lots of great stuff happening this week. I've just come from the 10th and first anniversary of the London Copy Fighters Drunken Brunch and Talking Shop, which is a kind of friends and family event I do for people I know who work on copyright-related issues in London. I get everyone together at my office, which is across the street from Speaker's Corner, and we have a slightly boozy brunch with champagne process, cheap wine, and then we go across the road and we give impromptu talks about copyright in between the Godbothers and the Marxists. It's always very, very fun, and we get weird hecklers today. Someone asked me if Jews were running my life, and I said, well, apart from the fact that my parents phone me up quite a bit and tell me what I should be doing, I'm not really controlled by the Jewish money people. That was clearly, I think, absolutely the weirdest heckler I've had so far, although we've had some very fun hecklers over the year. And the next one will be the last one that we have of this kind, because the office is going away. Their lease is up. So on March 19th, I'm going to have a public one. So if you happen to be in London, come on down. I'll be posting details soon. Other good news. Locus magazine, which is the trade magazine of science fiction, published its recommended reading list of 2005 publications, and I'm pleased to say that I picked up 3 recommendations. The first one that I think would be of interest to you particularly is that this story that I'm reading, Human Readable, was recommended as one of the best novellas of 2005. A story I wrote called I, Robot. It's also recommended for Best Novelette. And Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town, my novel that I published last year, was recommended for Best Novel. It's all good news. After the Siege, the story that was the first story I podcasted on this podcast, which you can go back and listen to, by the way, if you go to craphound.com/podcast.php, or just go to craphound.com and click the podcast link. Human Readable, still waiting to hear about its English publication, but I'm really delighted to announce that it will have its first publication in Russian, in a magazine called Elsi, E-L-S-I, which I'm told means if, and they'll be translating it and publishing it in Russian. That's very exciting, because the story was inspired by a trip I took to Russia last summer to St. Petersburg with my family. I'm walking around the streets of St. Petersburg with my grandmother. My grandmother was a survivor of the siege of Leningrad, where for 900 days Hitler laid siege to this city, and millions died, and she witnessed cannibalism and had to dig trenches and so on, and we walked around the streets of Petersburg, and she pointed and said things like, that's the window that we threw the corpses out of because we were too weak to carry them down the stairs, and so on. Anyway, so it's quite cool for me that this story is going to be published in Russian initially. A little kind of nod to my heritage there. And then finally, I'll be leaving for Geneva on Thursday and Friday. I'll be in Geneva at the LIFT conference. So if you're in Switzerland, hope to see you there. So without further ado, I will have you listen to the 3rd installment, or is it the 4th? I don't even remember, of Human Readable. Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend. She got the boy breathing, and ended up with more puke on her face, on Rayner's jacket, in her hair. His pulse was thready, but there. She turned to the swimmer and saw that he was a muscular surfer dude in board shorts with a couple of bitchin' tats and a decent body paint job. He was breathing too, but his heart was erratic as hell. She pressed 2 fingers to his throat. "What happened?" she said. "Who saw it happen?" One of the aunts stepped forward and said, "My son says they were playing—" She held up her hand. "And where's your son?" she said. "He's back at the house," the aunt said, startling back. "Send someone for him, then tell me what happened." The aunt looked like she'd been slapped, but the other relatives were staring at her, and so she had to talk. And then the boy arrived, and he told it again, and it was pretty much the same story, but she was able to get more details as she began to examine both the boy and the surfer's bodies for cuts, bruises, breaks, and punctures. She gave the boy's clothing the same treatment she'd given her own, gently but forcefully tearing them off, using a seashell to start the tears at first, then a pocket knife that someone put into her hand. The story was that the kids had been playing when they'd seen the surfer floating out in the breakers, and they dared each other to fish him out, and the undertow had sucked them out to sea. One had gotten away, the other had ended up out beyond the waves, and meanwhile the surfer had beached himself on his own. "Right," she said. "Blankets and pillows. Elevate their feet and wrap them up good." She stood up and staggered a step or two before Rayner caught her, and the crowd made a noise that was at once approving and scandalized. "Get me to the sea," she said. "I need to soak my head." So he walked her into the water, he still in his suit pants and dress shirt and tie, and held on to her while she dunked her head and swirled a mouthful of salt water in her mouth. "Where are the fucking paramedics?" she said as she sloshed back with him. "There," he said, pointing to the horizon, where a Coast Guard clipper was zooming for the shore. "The cell phone was dead, so I fired up a couple flares. You didn't hear them?" "No," she said. He could have set off a cannon and she wouldn't have noticed it. She got back to the shore just in time to see the surfer convulse. She was on him in a second, kneeling at his side, doing airway breathing circulation checks, finding no pulse, and slamming him onto his back and beginning CPR. Some time later, she was lifted off him, and the two paramedics went to work on him. Someone put a robe over her shoulders and a cup of juice in her hands. She dropped the juice in the sand, and sticky liquid and beach sand covered her legs, which she realized now that she hadn't depilated in a week, and that made her realize that she'd spent a pretty crucial amount of time prancing around naked in front of her date's family, and that was probably not on the timetable until at least the 15th date. She looked up at Raynor, who was still in his shoes, as she was in her bare feet, loomed over her. "God," she said, "Raynor." He kissed her. "I love you, Patricia," he said. "Ooh," she said with a weak smile, "you're breaking the rules." "Can you let it go just once?" She made her scrunchy, thinky face and then nodded. "Just don't make a habit of it, you lunk." It would have been a perfect day, if only the surfer hadn't died. They didn't get home until well after midnight. Parts of L.A. appeared to be on fire as they inched their way along the freeway. It was weird to see L.A. at this speed. They were used to clipping along at 60 or 70, over 80 if the traffic was light, flying over the freeway so fast that the scenery was just a blur. Only the year before, the New Yorker had run a 40-page paean to L.A., a public apology declaring it the most livable city in America now that it had licked its traffic problems. It balanced lots of personal space with thorough urbanization and urbanity. It was why they both lived there. Now they seemed to have traveled back 50 years in time, to the bad old traffic jam and smog days. Looters danced below, torching stores, and traffic moved so slowly that some people were apparently abandoning their cars to walk home, which made the traffic even worse. The smoke from the fires turned the sunset into a watercolor of reds and mustards and golds, tones that had been blown away with the smog when the last gas-sucking Detroitmobile had been retired for a plastic nickel-metal hydride jelly bean, and all the lanes were repainted to cut them in half. It was nightmarish. When they got off the ramp at Studio City, they found homeless guys directing traffic with gas tubes they'd torn out of bus shelters. The tubes glowed in the presence of the microwave radio frequency radiation, as each of the trillions of invisible ants in the system attempted to connect with its neighbors and get the traffic set to rights again. The RF noise made the gas tubes glow like sodium lamps. They coasted into Tricia's driveway and collapsed in her living room. "You were wonderful, darling," Raynor said, peeling off the tracksuit that one of his cousins had scrounged from the gym bag in her trunk and donated to Trish. Her skin was gritted with sand and streaked with stripes of sunburn. "God," Trish said, lolling on the sofa, just letting him gently brush away the sand and rub lotion into her skin. "You spoil me," she said. "You're unspoilable," he said. "Wonderful girl." "You saved their lives," he said. "What a fucking day," she said. "You think that my lifeguard training made up for my scandalous undergarments and your family's minds?" He snorted, and she felt his breath tickle the fine hairs of her tummy. "You're kidding. My mom told me that if I didn't marry you, she'd have me killed and then fix you up with someone else from the family. Told me it was my duty to see to it that you didn't get away, just in case someone else falls into the ocean." He looked around at all the blank walls. "Creepy not to have any news at all," he said. "There's a TV in the garage," she said, "or maybe the attic. You could find it and plug it in and find out that no one else knows what's going on, if you feel like it. Or I could escort you to the bathtub, and we could scrub each other clean, and then I could give you a massage," he said. "Yes, or you could do that." "Where did you say the television was?" he said. "You are going to be in so much trouble," She twined her fingers in his hair and pulled him up to kiss her. Part 2. Progress Pilgrims. It took 3 days for even the thinnest crawls to return to the walls. In the meantime, people dug out old one-to-many devices, like the radios and the televisions, and set them up on their lawns so they could keep track of the aftermath of the downtime. He slept over those 3 nights because no one was going anywhere anyway, and they had a running argument over how many dates this counted as, but truth be told, they had a wonderful time making omelets for one another, washing each other's backs in the shower, stealing moments of sex in the living room at 2 in the afternoon without worrying about being interrupted by a chime, a ringer, a bell, or a vibe. When they weren't enjoying each other, they took coolers of fizzy drinks onto the lawn and watched the neighbor's TV set and saw the pundits describing the downtime. The news shows were having a drunken ball with this one. As the only game in town, they were free to bring a level of craft to their newsmongering that hadn't been seen since Trish's parents' day, when news networks turned catastrophes into light operas, complete with soundtracks, brand identities, logo marks, and intermissions where buffoons worked the audience for laughs. "Oh, she's your favorite, isn't she?" Trish said, goosing Rayner's bicep and taking a sip of his peach gingerade. The pundit had been in heavy rotation since the TV went back on the air. She was a Norwegian academic mathematician who wrote books of popular philosophy. She was a collection of trademark affectations, a jacket with built-up shoulders, a monocle, a string tie, nipple tassels, and tattooed cross-hatching on her face that made her look like a woodcut a Victorian counting-house clerk. Rayner loathed her. She'd been on the committee to which he'd defended his philosophy of networks thesis, and she'd busted his balls so hard they still ached a decade later when he saw her on the tube. The pundit explained the packet switching, using the trains versus automobiles as a metaphor. In a circuit universe, every communication gets its own dedicated line, like a train on a track. When I want to talk to you, we build a circuit, a train on a track, between our devices. No one else can use those tracks, even if we're not talking. But packet switching is like a freeway. We break the information into packets, and we give every packet its own little car, and it finds its own way to the other end. If one car doesn't arrive, we make a copy of its information and send it again. The cars have brakes and steering wheels, and so they can all share the same road without too much trouble. Rayner grit his teeth and hissed at the set. "She's faking that accent," he said. "She thinks that Americans believe that anyone with a European accent is smarter than we are. She can pronounce V and W perfectly well when she wants to. She speaks better English than I do. Besides, she stole that line from me," he said, "from my thesis," and he said, his face scrunching up again. "Shh, shh," Trish said, laughing at him. He wasn't really angry, she knew, just a little stir-crazy. He was a networking guy. He should have been out there trying to make the network go again, but he was on sabbatical and no one at UCLA wanted to hear from him just then. And then the pundit was off onto ants, network modeled on ant colonies that use virtual pheromones to explore all possible routes in real time and emerge solutions to the problem of getting everything, everywhere in the shortest time. Rayner was barking at the TV now, and Trish knew that he was doing it more to entertain her as much as for any other reason, so she laughed and egged him on. The TV cut back to a news dude, who was a very cuddly Ewok who'd made his name hosting a Wheel of Fortune, jumping up and down and squeaking excitedly and adorably whenever a contestant won the grand prize, his fur plugs quivering. He cupped his paws to his cheeks and grinned. "But ants aren't perfect, are they?" the Ewok said. "He's feeding her," Rayner said. "She's going off on her stupid walking in circles bit. The thing about using virtual ants to map out the world and make routing recommendations is that we can't really tell the difference between a good solution and a bad one without trying it. Sometimes ants end up walking in circles, reinforcing their scent until they starve to death. We might find that our cars tell us that the best way from San Francisco to San Jose is via a 150-mile detour to Las Vegas. It may be true, if all the traffic everywhere is bad enough, that might be the fastest way, but it could just be the ants going in circles." "God, talk about taking a metaphor too far," he said. Trish thought that Rayner was perfectly happy to think about the ants as ants, except when someone raised a point like this, but she didn't see any reason to raise that point just then. The Ewok turned to the camera. One scientist says we should be expecting more downtimes to come. When we come back from this break, we'll talk to a University of Waterloo researcher who claims that this is just the first of many more downtimes. The screen cut over to a beautiful, operatic advertisement for some Brazilian brand of Coca-Cola. Wittily written, brilliantly shot, with an original score by a woman who'd won 3 Grammys on the Independent Music Awards in Kamchatka the year before. They watched it with mild attention, and Trish absently fished another bottle out of the cooler and chewed the lid off with her side molars. She looked at Rayner. He was gripping the armrests of his inflatable chair tightly, dimpling the hard plastic. She held the bottle to his lips, and he took it, and then she rubbed at his shoulders while he took a swallow. "Let's go inside and play," she said. "They won't have anything new to tell us for days."